afternoon, and I would also like to say it's great to see everybody here, so thanks for making the time to come out. Before I introduce the speaker, I do want to take a chance to talk to Trey and Elise real fast. So I understand that Hip Hop B picked a song and a costume last night. So if there's any influence that you have with Danny about having Aubrey's 5 numbers in the first half of the show, that would be awesome. So I promise to stay for at least one of the entire show, because I do enjoy watching both of you. I think you're fantastic dancers. I know, Elise, you're my wife's favorite.
That might cost you
So maybe that'll cost me, but
it will.
so good luck in the upcoming show. So.
Thank you.
So today I have the honor of introducing my very close friend and softball sideline dad, Dr. Chris Hardy. So Professor Hardy holds a PhD in systemic botany from Cornell University and studied and worked at the New York Botanical Gardens and the University of Zurich in Switzerland before becoming professor of botany and curator of the herbarium. Yep, nice. At Millersville University in Pennsylvania. As a university professor, Dr. Hardy teaches courses in botany, forensic botany, and introductory biology. His research includes systemic botany, forensic botany, botany education, and biodiversity informatics. He has widely traveled, not only on the softball circuit now, right, but also through tropical America, South Africa, Europe in support of his work, and is the author of more than 60 scientific names of plants and 30 published works in his field. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Hardy.
It really is an honor coming to a great community organization. I really have a lot of respect for, places like the Lions Club, the Rotary clubs throughout the area here. So it's great work that you do. And of course, I thank you very much, Sean, for inviting me here today. And I just wanted to also have a shout out for my wife, Natalie. We celebrated our 15-year anniversary last night. Okay, so I'm a professor at Elizabethtown University. I've been there since 2005, and I'm not actually by label a forensic botanist, but I have been called upon to participate in some cases. And so I'm going to talk about some of those cases today, but I wanted to start with one of the most famous cases, the Lindbergh kidnapping in 1932. And so, this was a big deal. Many of you probably already know many of the details about this, but the first child, the firstborn, only 20-month-old child of the Lindberghs was kidnapped from his nursery window on the night of March 1st, 1932, and taken, and a ransom note was left. And just to drive it home, of course, both of the parents came from really powerful, influential families. Charles Lindbergh Jr.'s dad, of course, was Charles Lindbergh, and Charles Lindbergh's father was a U.S. representative from Minnesota. Her father, Anne Moreau Lindbergh, was a J.P. Morgan partner. He was also a U.S. senator, and her mother he was also an ambassador to Mexico, and her mother herself was a poet, a president of a university, and a women equality activist. And of course, Charles Lindbergh flew the first solo non-stop flight from New York City to Paris. It was a big deal back then. In 1927, that flight spurred global interest in commercial aviation and airmail, and he was Time's first man of the year. Anne herself was an author and aviator. She actually was trained by her husband, and then they flew a lot of exploratory missions, charting new courses to the Orient, charting airmail courses all across North America. And so here they are, she was a co-pilot with him on this one particular flight, charting a new course to the Orient. They stopped over in Manitoba here, and that's when the picture was taken. And of course, if you've ever been to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the Spirit of St. Louis plane that Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic is hanging from the ceiling. So this was a big deal. This is the nursery window from which the child presumably was taken. This is the sill on which the ransom note was left, looking out into the yard here. This was taken the day after the kidnapping. This is March 2nd, 1932. Here's the ransom note. I'll translate it for you. It says, "Dear sir, have 50,000 ready. have $25,000 in 20 bills, have $15,000 in $10 bills, and $10,000 in $5 bills. After 2 to 4 days, we'll inform you where it's, these are actual misspellings, so I'm not, you know, these are real misspellings. and of course it goes into evidence that this probably was not someone whose English was his first language. They're going to deliver the money. You know, they want you to know where you can deliver the money. We warn you for making anything public or for notify the police. The child is in good care, which is a big key, of course. I lived in Switzerland in the German-speaking part, so I know that that means good in German. And indication for all letters are this signature with 3 holes. So there's basically 2 overlapping circles, a circle of ink in the middle, and then 2 holes punched in the paper. And that was the official notification that you received a letter from the kidnapper. On March 2nd, the day after, in daylight, they recovered this 3-foot telescoping ladder from nearby in the bushes. It wasn't directly beneath the window, but there were prints from the ladder beneath the window, which suggested that that ladder had been used to access the window. There was a 3/4 inch chisel found outside beneath the window. There were 2 sets of footprints leading off of the property, and no fingerprints were not found in the room. They were not found in the ladder at all. At least that's what they say. So eventually, on April 2nd, so a month later, a ransom was paid, $50,000. It was paid in the night in a Bronx cemetery to someone named Cemetery John, under the cover of darkness. The bills, as specified by the kidnappers, were unmarked, but of course, the authorities did record the serial numbers of all the bills. And this is what the bills would have looked like, at least the $10 notes. Many of the bills were gold certificates, okay? The United States, up through 1933, was on what's called a gold standard. And so these bills with the gold mark were backed by, gold. You could return the bill for that quantity of gold. In 1933, we went off of the gold standard, and that's one of the reasons that the authorities had such a large amount of gold notes in the ransom money, because they knew what was coming in 1933 was that there was going to be an executive order placed by then President Roosevelt for everyone to return those gold notes. Okay, so it kind of hamstringed the kidnappers a little bit, and of course, it threw up a big flag if you were spending gold notes past 1933. So that's one of the reasons that they paid the ransom in such a large number of gold notes. The baby at that point was said to be on a boat. So imagine their disappointment when you pay $50,000 in a cemetery. There's no baby, but he's in a boat called I forget the name of the boat. I think it's called the Nana in Martha's Vineyard, off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. And so they went up there looking for this boat, and they didn't find it. And of course, on March 12th, the baby was found dead, only 4 miles from the home. And the baby had been dead for about 2 months, so it's likely that the baby died or was murdered that night of the kidnapping. This is actually a local paper, of course. I pulled this last night. They weren't able to actually have the headline the day the baby was discovered because, it was discovered that day and, you can't get the paper out. But nevertheless, the next day on May 13th, here's a picture up in New Jersey of some people from the area huddling around where the baby was found. There's lots of stories, Herbert Hoover, the president who preceded Roosevelt in 1932 to 1933, is obviously calling for a big federal involvement at this point. Charles Lindbergh was a national hero. We need to get, all resources behind this to capture the kidnappers. And this is just one from the Midwest of that day. They were able to get that in the evening edition. Okay, so eventually the trail turns cold, right? They pay the ransom. There's no baby. The kidnappers are nowhere to be found. So eventually, this botanist from the USDA Forest Products Laboratory in Wisconsin, he's writing to the New Jersey State Police. It was a state police investigation. He's like, look, I'm an expert on wood. Give me the ladder. Maybe I can do something with it. And so eventually they give him the ladder. And so from 1932 to 1933, over the span of 18 months, he studies the ladder. And he discovers through lots of investigation using the microscope that there's 3 types of wood that are used to make the ladder. Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and North Carolina pine. That's unusual to have 3 different types of wood making a ladder. It was homemade, okay, judging from the fact that 3 different types of wood were used to make the ladder. Not all the pieces of wood used for the rails are the uprights of a ladder, so there's 6 rails here. Not all of them were the same thickness, okay, that's unusual. There were clear marks of hand chisels that were used, also hand planers to work the rungs of the ladder, to cut out the recesses in which the rungs would have been laid. It was clearly made by someone at home and someone who knew a little bit about carpentry but wasn't very good. He said that the 3/4 inch chisel was used to cut out the recesses. And of course, the chisel was found at the crime scene, the year before. He also was able to determine that a saw that was 0.035 inches wide was used to cut the recesses out, and it had 10 teeth per inch. This guy is pretty amazing with what he could tell. He also identified that a hand planer with very unique patterns of nicks and defects was used. And so he basically constructed a profile of the ladder's maker. And then he was actually able to trace the wood in the ladder, okay, to a shipment that was delivered to a lumber yard in the Bronx, okay, the National Lumber and Millwork Company in the Bronx in 1931. So he's actually, targeting a shipment there. And one of the rails, okay, this one right here on the right, one of the rails was actually not a standard cut of board that would have been used for a ladder. It actually likely came from an attic floor or a barn floor because it was thinner and it had holes from nails that were the spacing of joists and a floor. So that all went to the state police and eventually the FBI. He said, when you find a guy, check his ad. Okay, so a big break in the story came in 1934. Gold certificate, a $10 gold certificate bill with a ransom, serial number on it, was passed at a gas station in New Jersey. The gas station attendant marked the license plate of the driver who passed it down because he was acting suspiciously, at least to the attendant. And then when the attendant, deposited that money in a bank teller noticed that this is a ransom note. And so here it is. Here's the $10 note. Here's a serial number that matches the ransom money, and here's the license plate on the bill. And of course, obviously the guy was caught because here's a picture of the car with that license plate. And so they traced that license plate to an unemployed former handyman turned Wall Street investor in the Bronx. Who, by the way, had worked in 1930 and 1931 at the National Lumber and Millwork Company in the Bronx. Okay, so here's the guy, Bruno Richard Halpman. He went by the name of Richard, not Bruno. Although all the papers did report him as Bruno at the time, they were trying to make him sound more foreign and more German. That would help the jury kind of convict him. But nevertheless, there was enough evidence that you didn't need to work on people's prejudices, okay, to convict him. He was a German immigrant, recent employee of that lumber yard. He quit his job the day after, as it turns out, the ransom payment was made. And he had a criminal record of burglaries in Germany, one of which was robbing the mayor's house in his hometown of Germany with a ladder from the second story. In his garage, hidden behind a wall, was an old can of shellac with $14,600 of the ransom money stuffed inside. In his garage was a chisel set missing its 3/4 inch chisel. So here's the 3/4 inch chisel recovered underneath the window at the Lindbergh estate, and here's a chisel in his set that is part of the same set of 1/4 inch chisel. So this is the evidence. This is, that from the scene, and this is from his garage, just to show that it was made by the same company with the same markings on it. Here's his hand planer, and what Kohler did did, the botanist from the USDA, was here's rung number 8 from the ladder recovered at the scene, here's rung number 10, and here's rail number 16, all of which were hand planed. And you see a very distinctive set of grooves from nicks in the blade of the planer. And then he got the same type of wood, ponderosa pine, new wood, Kohler did, and he used the planer to plane that wood just to demonstrate that it would make the same marks on the new wood that was made on the ladder recovered at the Lindbergh estate. And so then they took photographs of all these and lined them up. So these 3 pieces are from the ladder recovered at the Lindbergh home. These 2 pieces on the end are new wood that Kohler had made the chisel mark on. So this is all entered into evidence in the court, and I'm taking these photos from the New Jersey State Police Archives. Okay, so because Kohler did such good work, he said, look, when you're at the house looking for the money, go up into the attic and look for a missing board. Remember, one of the rails, the uprights of the ladder, was presumably taken from something like that. And so, whoops. And so here's the attic of the Kaufman home, and here's a length of this board that's missing. Here's the rail from that ladder taken off of the ladder and set onto the joists, right, to look for a match. This is what it looks like. You can see the holes match up with nails that were actually stuck back into the joist, so they had to remove the nails, put the board down, and then they could place the nails back into the rail of that ladder. And it matched up perfectly all across, I think, 6 or 7 joists. Over here is the board from the attic, right here. Here's the board from the ladder, and there is a little inch gap missing right there. And you put a little piece of paper there, and an artist kind of sketched out where the grain of the wood would have gone. And you can see that the grain from the ladder matches with the grain from the board. Another thing, can you see right here, there's a little nick in that board right here. That is made with a saw that had 10 teeth per inch that was 0.035 inches in thickness. So he cut it right there and then went over a little bit into the next board. So this is damning evidence. This is damning evidence. And so Exhibit A at the trial is the ladder. This is them bringing the ladder into the Flemington courthouse in New Jersey in 1935. And one journalist called the testimony of this botanist here, Arthur Kohler, one of the most astonishing tales of scientific detective work ever related, which puts the great fictional exploits of Sherlock Holmes in the shade. Here they're calling him the wood Sherlock, okay? The wood detective. And here he is pointing the finger, I presume, at someone, maybe Holmes. Here's Edward J. Riley. The New York Herald spent a lot of money to hire a big lawyer, Edward J. Riley, to defend Holman. This was good news, right? So they gave him a great defense lawyer. He was known as the Bull of Brooklyn. Criminal defense lawyer, got lots of criminals off. Well, here he is trying to denigrate Kohler, the expert witness, referring to Kohler. There is no such animal as an expert on wood, trying to get the judge to reject him as an expert witness. His is not a science that has been recognized by the courts. That is not in the class with handwriting experts, with fingerprint experts, or ballistic experts. These are mere opinions of a lumber crew, which is a derogatory term for someone who just goes out and works with wood all day. Okay, or looks at trees and says, we can get 600 board feet out of that. But that day, to the journalists outside the courtroom, he said, I've never heard more damaging testimony or seen more enthralling demonstration than that presented in the courtroom today by Arthur Kohler. So he was double speaking, right? In the courtroom, he's saying one thing, but he's admitting it's pretty damning testimony. And of course, what he was talking about was all the evidence I just showed in the previous slide. And then of course, here's a Reading Times cartoon after the day's trial. Here's the lawyer, and here's Hoffman bound by all the evidence. We shall now attempt one of the most difficult escape acts on record. Okay, so for what it's worth, he was convicted. He was electrocuted in 1936. Okay, so forensic botany is the application of plants or plant science to legal matters. These are not necessarily criminal matters. There's food safety, quality assurance matters. When a company finds plant matters, foreign objects in their food, they need to know what it is. And I've done several cases like that. So I consider that to be forensic botany. That's not a criminal case. There could be cases where plants are directly used in the commission of a crime, like the ladder, the wood used to make the ladder. Poisonings, people have been poisoned with plants on purpose. Drugs, of course, are illegal plants. Cocaine, weapons, of course, can be made from plant material. All of these things can enter into evidence. And of course, plants can be used as trace evidence linking suspects to a crime. So they're not directly involved in the crime itself, but they can link a suspect to a crime or a crime scene. And the Lindbergh trial is what really brought this for its potential to global prominence, yet it's still quite underutilized. And so I'm going to talk about some of these, just a couple more cases here that I've been involved with. And just to show you that not everything's criminal, this is a consumer complaint that I worked on back in 2020. This is an old student of mine. He reaches out to me. He's now a food safety and quality manager at a local food company, makes cookies, animal crackers. And he says, look, many years ago you were my botany professor. I'm now the quality assurance manager. Look, I've got some foreign objects in the crackers. Consumers complain, bit into them. I need to know what they are. I think they're pieces from mace. Mace is some of the spice that they use to make the animal crackers. So I tell them, send them to me. This is obviously a concern. They could be allergens that could cause someone to go into anaphylactic shock. They could be choking hazards. So these are real concerns. Now, the reason I think it's mace is because it's an ingredient, and what they want is a third party to have some authority so they can go to the spice supplier and say, look, you have these contaminants in your spice, we can't have that, we need to work together to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's what they want from me, is some sort of authoritative statement as to what this is. And for this particular case, I got paid in the case of cookies. I can't reveal what cookies they are, because then you would know the maker, because they're a very distinctive cookie. Right? How many cases of cookies have you seen? 3 over the years. It's 3 different cases like this where I've gotten paid for cookies. I think I'm going to ask for money next time. Okay, so just a long story short, this is mace right here. Mace is where nutmeg comes from. The seed is the source of the nutmeg spice, but on the outside there's a red arrow that when it's pulled off and dried, it becomes the mace. Mace has the same flavor as nutmeg, it's just less, strong. And it's conceivable. Here's the foreign contaminants. I've lettered them in this photograph. These look like woody stems, presumably the little stalk on a fruit. So it's perfectly conceivable that these are mace. Maybe this little piece right here, G, is a piece of the dried mace spice. It's perfectly conceivable, but grapes actually turned out to be a better fit. I had to eat a lot of grapes and a lot of fruits to figure this one out. I just spent a month just, going through fruit after fruit after fruit until I found one that fit, okay, the look. So here's some grapes I photographed, and then I pulled the grapes off and photographed it like that, and then here's the foreign objects. And then, if you look up close, here's the grapes right here, and then here's the foreign objects, and I was able to reconstruct them right here. There's very distinctive lenticels, which are the little pores through which the stem breathes. This piece, which they thought was the mace spice, is actually just the dried remnants that is left behind when you pull off the grape. And so that's just a case of where, my conclusion was, it's not mace, it's grapes. And actually, my conclusion was that it's more likely someone eating grapes at your factory than it is the spice company. So, and the reason was, you see how clean this is, the way it dried? Most likely someone was eating it, dropped it into the batch, into the dough, and then it got stuck there, compressed, and baked into the cookie. If this dries by itself, it wrinkles, it shrivels. But look how neatly, compressed that is. So it was baked in and dried, surrounded by dough. So it most likely happened at the factory, before the cookie was baked. So that's helpful for them, right? So now all you have to do is find the person who was on duty when that lot of cookies was made, okay? And get a little reprimanded. Okay, this is another case that I was involved with recently. In August, I testified in this case down in Florida. This man was found guilty of murdering the 16-year-old daughter of his girlfriend. On April 13th, she missed her bus in Sorrento. She was supposed to go to Mount Dora High School. She asked him to drive her to school that day. He did not. She goes missing. 5 days later, her body was found in a remote woodland. Here's a little scale here. This was about a 45-minute drive. So this is near Orlando down here. This is DeLand, Florida. Up here is Daytona Beach. The case went cold for a long time. The local authorities kind of dropped the ball on following some leads that they should have made. The state investigators got involved, brought in the Department of Homeland Security, forensics expert, digital forensics expert, brought in a botanist, myself, and we looked at the evidence. There's plenty of evidence in the car of the suspect. Plants that were found in the car that are also found at the crime scene. This is where the body was found, and here's all of those plants in his trunk and in his back seat that are also found at the crime scene. So to have deposited the body at the crime scene and to gotten out of there, or to open the trunk, leads would have been, very low. You had to kind of crawl in there. And so it's very likely that leaves would have dropped off of these plants and been deposited in his trunk. And so the digital forensic evidence placed him at the crime scene. Her phone, his phone, could be tracked to the crime scene. Instead of going towards the high school that day, they went out there. And then the physical evidence, the plant evidence, places them there as well. So a combination of evidence was used in that case. Now, I wanted to go into detail in this case right here. This is a recent case. It's not quite, it hasn't gone to trial yet, but I feel like I can report it because it's been all over the news. I talked to the investigating agency, the sheriff's office down in Orange County. I was like, I've got interview requests with news stations. Do you want me to take this? It hasn't even gone to trial yet. They're like, absolutely. We've got it all up on our Facebook page. So I feel like I can talk about it because all the evidence is out there already. Okay. This is actually from their Facebook page. Okay. So they took my report and put a picture of the suspect in there and were very advertising quite a bit. Okay, so this happened in 2020. Actually, it happened in 2018, but the evidence came to bear in 2020. Okay, so the incident, a 23-year-old female is walking home from work. She's a cook around midnight on May 11th, 2020. So I guess it did happen in 2020. I get cases confused. And here she is walking along this road. She's not actually there, but that's what the road looks like. This is a sidewalk. There's a male attacker, grabs her from behind, drags her into the retention pond. So there's a retention pond about 40 feet to the side here, and he drags her behind this culvert, okay, for privacy. And he chokes her and holds her underneath the water until she relents and agrees to do what he wants her to do. Then, when she relents, he drops his pants, and she sees a car coming out of a nearby housing development, and she makes a run for it. And she gets away, the guy stops in the car, he calls 911, and the attacker flees. So nothing happened, right? She got away. So now she's got a description to give to the sketch artist. So she describes a person in his 20s or 30s. They start looking around for surveillance cameras in the area. This is where the attack took place. And they detect the presence of this United Airtime van in the area. Not at the crime scene, but in the area. So then they go to the company and they show the company the sketch. And they said, do you have anyone who would have had this van at that time who might look like this? And they say, we do. We've got one employee who has that van and resembles that sketch. So now they have a suspect. So they go to his home 3 days later, May 15th. They arrest him because he had outstanding warrants for sex crimes in Tennessee. Because at this point, there wasn't much evidence linking him to this crime. But there was more evidence from Tennessee to link him to another crime, so they were able to arrest him. And so detectives went there the next day, and they took water samples, they took vegetation samples. Here's the retention pond. They went to the victim and they got her pants, her shirt. You can see it's covered with algae, it's wet, it's covered with sand. They took his pants, his shoes, you can see they're also wet, they're covered with sand, covered with algae. And they asked me if I could do anything with it. So the first thing I noticed is that they're wet. They're covered with algae and sand. That's consistent with the victim's narrative. She was dragged into a pond and choked. So both of those match up between the victim's clothing and the suspect's clothing. Then I looked at the algae. And the most conspicuous algae was the filamentous kind of hair-like strands. And here it is in the pond water. Here it is on the victim's shirt, the victim's pants, the suspect's left shoe, his right shoe, his pants, right cuff inside. Here's the right inner thigh of his pants. Here's the right pocket. So there's algae in the right pocket of his pants. And they're all the same species. Then I took a closer look at stuff I couldn't see with the naked eye and were highly microscopic. There's 25 species I found across all three samples of the pond water, the victim's clothing, the suspect's clothing. But these 13 were found on all three. These 13. So that's a high coincidence. So these are all numbered based on what's in the report, but nevertheless, there's 13 distinct species of microscopic algae which were found on the victim's clothing, the suspect's clothing, and in the pond. Then there's one particular group of algae, 6 different species right here, that were really abundant. And that offered me an opportunity to look at it with a statistical framework. When you have lots of something, you can analyze it in a statistical framework. You can look at the relative abundances of these species on the victim's clothing, the suspect's clothing, and in the pond water. And so when you look at these relative abundances, we've got these black bars representing what's on the victim's clothing. The white bars represent what's on the suspect's clothing, and the gray bars represent what's in the pond water. And so here's the 6 different species of algae, diatoms, a specific type of algae. And you can see that Nitzschia clausii, 15%, 22%, 17%, very similar relative abundances. When you go to different streams and different ponds, you find very different profiles of algae, very different communities. So in one pond, you might find Nitzschia clausii is the dominant alga. Then you go to another pond, even though it's similar looking, you might find none of that, but you might find more of this. So every water body has its kind of unique community with a distinct profile of relative abundances of different species. And so what we see with this is that it's very similar on all 3 samples, all the 6 of these species. There's a few differences here, but nevertheless, it's very similar. So I applied a statistical test called a chi-square homogeneity test to this. You students should know what that is when you get into college, okay? So I first compared, you have to do these in pairwise comparisons. So I first compared the relative numbers of these algae that I found on the suspect and the victim's clothing. And I found a statistical match, right? But then I compared the suspect's clothing to what I found in the pond, and the victim's clothing to what I found in the pond. There was no match. So here's this absurd conclusion, that I can match the suspect to the victim, but I can't match the victim to the pond that she said the crime took place in, right? Kind of perplexing. So then I got looking at this, and do you notice any species here, one of these 6, that kind of stands out as having a very distinctive difference between what's in the pond and what's on the victim? This one? Yeah, you're right. There's 0 on the suspect here, but there's only like 1 on the victim and only 3 in the pond. And so even though that's a big difference, there's not a lot there to say anything about. Very poor statistical inference there. But this tabellaria in particular, look in the pond. It's only at about 5% in the pond, but over 23% on the victim and the suspect. So I got into looking at tabellaria, that alga species, a little bit more closely. And so this particular alga is known for, it occurs as a colony of cells. So it occurs in these ribbons of like 100 or 500 cells long. And those ribbons are attached to submerged surfaces. So they're attached to submerged rocks and concrete structures. They're attached to leaves. Here's a picture of an aquatic leaf under the water, and here's all these little tabularias. All these cylindrical things that are attached to one another are that tabullaria. They're attached to surfaces. So the only way you're going to get them is to shake those surfaces, right? You're not going to just take a cup and go into the water like the investigators did and pull out those. You got to shake those surfaces. You got to disturb those leaves and those rocks and concrete surfaces to get those to fall off of those surfaces and then come into the water column. So what I did was I removed that species, since it's a species that likes to be attached. And when I remove that species from the analysis, I recover a statistical match between the suspect and the victim, the suspect in the pond, and the victim in the pond. So not only am I able to place the suspect with the victim, statistically, but I'm able to place the suspect and the victim in that pond in a situation in which there's a violent struggle that disturbs the surfaces of those structures sufficiently to release that alga. Okay, so that's it. I just want to have some summary and conclusions here. So remember Edward J. Riley, who tried to convince the court that there's no such animal as a botanist, and there's no such science as botany that would be comparable to ballistics and fingerprint evidence. There are such animals, and the court considers those to be experts, and it started with the Lindbergh kidnapping. Plants and their parts, they adorn our surroundings. They're all around us. They're in our gardens. We're wearing them right now, right? Cotton is a plant. So there's a lot of evidence, potentially. Plants are useful structures. So, Bruno Hauptmann made a ladder, out of wood. And when you look at the ecological basis for that, I don't need to go there, but if you look at this is called a biomass pyramid. It's something you learn in basic biology. When you go out into the wild and you have all your biomass there, 90% of that biomass is plant biomass. And so what a criminal sees as a potential cover, right, to hide a crime is actually a lot of evidence, okay, that a botanist can kind of sort through. And so that's all I've got to say. It's an underutilized science. Thanks to Kohler, okay, botany is something that is increasingly being used in the courtroom when the evidence permits. And so I thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yes, Ralph.
Yes.
There are probably hundreds of people in our country that have your skills and teach in colleges or universities.